Today we're talking about information processing. So the information processing approach is an approach to understanding development that focuses on ways that people process information about their world. So it's the way they manipulate information that they come across, the way they monitor that information, how they create strategies to deal with it, all these different things. And the effectiveness with which we process information is going to involve paying attention, it's going to involve memory processes, and it's going to involve the way that we actually think about this information. So the information processing approach really compares the way that humans process information to the way computers do. So the very, very simplified idea here is that we both receive input from the outside world, some stimulus from our environment, and in computers there's hardware and software that has memory capabilities and can perform these operations. For us, that hardware and software would be our brain, our mind, our cognition processes, such as our problem-solving processes and things like that, how much we're aware of things. And so that information comes into our mind or into the computer, we do stuff with it, and then we can generate output based on that information. This is a very, very oversimplified model of information processing, but again, it's just the idea that there is some stimulus in the outside world, some information, something we see, something we hear. If we're paying attention to it, then we are capable of encoding that information, so that's getting it into our minds. Think of it as kind of like entering information on the keyboard. And then we hold on to that information for a period of time. This could be very short or very long, depending upon how we encode that information and what we do with it. And then we think about or process that information, and that is going to influence how we ultimately respond. The information processing to-store model focuses on short-term memory and long-term memory. So you've got input from the environment. This is some kind of stimulus, again, something you hear or see or taste or smell, or some combination of any of those. And then you've got your attention processes. So not everything that you encounter in the environment is going to be something that you're paying attention to and remember. If you've ever driven someplace and then arrived and realized that you don't actually remember actually driving there, it's probably because you weren't paying attention to the driving process. Your thoughts were elsewhere. Your attention was elsewhere. So with regard to attention, you can have sustained attention where you keep that up, selective attention where you're choosing to pay attention to some things and ignore other things, or divided attention where you're trying to actively pay attention and focus to more than one thing at a time. All these different types of attention are going to affect the degree and quality to which you encode that information from your environment. So how much of it actually makes it into your brain so that your brain has something to work with. Once it is in there, there are two memory processes that we're going to be focusing on in the to-store model. So there's two ways that memory is stored. There are two places, if you want to call it that. There's your short-term memory and your long-term memory. Your short-term memory is called short-term memory because it is very short. Okay, so it's very limited in duration. You can only really keep in mind, keep about 7, give or take 2 meaningful pieces of information at one time. So if someone gives you a list of things to get from the grocery store and they say, oh, we need this, this, and this, and you're like, okay, that's fine. And they say, oh, we also need this and this. Okay. Oh, you know what? We also need this, this, and this. And at that point you say, you know what? Maybe I should make a list. Because that's now you're starting to get now you're starting to strain that capacity. If it's just 3 things, no problem. But once you get 7 and above, it's probably a good idea to make a list. So it's limited capacity and limited duration. If you don't do anything with that information, it's just going to go away. Then you've got long-term memory. As a college student, you're probably very interested in long-term memory because you don't want to just understand it. You need to be able to pull that information up later on, either on a test or an assignment. So with long-term memory is theoretically permanent. We have not been able to notice any limits on long-term memory, just difficulties in retrieving that information, but as far as we can tell, the limit does not exist. Limitless capacity, so it's not like at a certain point in your life, learning something new means that some other memory gets pushed out of your head. We don't see any evidence of that. You have long-term memory of episodic events, such as events or experiences, things that happen to you, or you have semantic knowledge. So this is general knowledge of facts and concepts, such as how to do things, or that George Washington was the first president of the United States, that sort of thing. So these are all things that you have in your long-term memory. So how do we get information from short-term memory to long-term memory? It really depends on what you do with this information. So the longer the information is in your short-term memory, the more likely it is to be transferred to long-term memory. So the longer that you think about something, keep it in your mind, maybe repeat it to yourself, that's going to be in there for longer. So if you're trying to transfer information to your long-term memory, you want to use different strategies. You want to use rehearsal. That would be repeating something over and over again to yourself. Once upon a time, before we had smartphones, you had to actually dial someone's number in order to call them. And so if you called them often, eventually you just knew their phone number. You just memorized it because you had rehearsed it so many times. You had used that information and done that multiple times, and eventually you just remember it. So I still remember my childhood phone number. Elaboration is another strategy. So this is thinking more deeply about something. So getting more details, asking questions about it. If you're reading through your textbook, that's something that you want to do. You want to really think about the information, not just read it and be like, okay, I ran my eyes across the page, but did I do something with this information? You can create imagery in your mind, so things that you can vividly imagine tend to be easier for you to remember later on. And mnemonic devices are other things that you can use. So these are things that just help to reduce the amount of information that you're trying to hold on to. So things like the word homes is a mnemonic device that can be used to memorize the Great Lakes. So homes, that'd be Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior. Okay, or let's see, there's King Philip came over for good spaghettis, a kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, that sort of thing. These are mnemonic devices. So all these different things are tools that you can use to transfer information from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. Otherwise, you just forget right away. So if you've ever had someone tell you their name as they introduce themselves and you immediately forget their name, it's because that's going to happen after about 20 to 30 seconds. If you haven't done anything with that person's information, chances are you're not going to remember it. So do something, repeat it back to them, or think about it in some way, or say their name in your head several times to begin with, just something like that. And if you don't, then just, we've all had that experience. Just say, hey, I know you just told me, but remind me your name again, and then do something with that information. Okay, let's talk about some mechanisms of change in our information processing process. So one, as I've mentioned before, is encoding. So this is the mechanism by which information gets into your memory. So it's how that information is presented. So is it is it auditory? Is it visual? Is it even when it's visual, is it presented in one way versus another way? So an S in cursive versus an S in script. These are all just different little details about the information that is getting into your head. There's also automaticity. automaticity is the ability to process information with little or no effort. This is very, very important in the reading process. When children are learning how to read, initially it's going to be very slow and difficult because they're going to be spending a lot of mental processing power on decoding decoding those letters and symbols. But over time, as they get used to it, they will start to develop that automaticity where they begin to process that information about that decoding information. They're able to do that better and better with less and less effort, to the point that reading can become so automatic that even if you just look at a word, you'll read it even without trying to read it. It just becomes that automatic. Now, there are exceptions, obviously. Another is strategy construction. So another way that you can change the way that you process information is using strategies. So discovering new procedures for processing information. So thinking to yourself, oh, well, if I maybe take notes in this particular way, it helps me to understand that information better, that sort of thing. And then there's metacognition. This is knowing about knowing, or thinking about thinking. So knowing about the way that people acquire and have knowledge, thinking about the way that people think and have thoughts. We'll talk about some of this towards the end. Okay, so in the information processing approach, one issue is the speed of processing information, and this is assessed using reaction time tasks. Some small children, if you've ever tossed a ball to a young child, their physical reaction time is not all that great. They might try to catch the ball, but not before the ball has already, hit them in the head. As we go through childhood and adolescence and everything, our reaction time gets better and better. Our ability to process information speeds up, and we're able to take more information coming at us at a time, up to a certain point. So there are changes in the speed of processing. It improves dramatically through childhood and adolescence. Partly, these changes are due to myelination. So in infancy and childhood, our neurons are becoming more and more myelinated. So there's this fatty layer that insulates the axons of our neurons. And as that insulation occurs, the electrical signals become more efficient and quick. And so that's part of the speed in the processing speed changes. Another is experience. As we gain experience, we just have more to draw upon, and we can anticipate things a little bit better. Now, this does begin to decline in middle adulthood, and those declines do continue into late adulthood. So this is why you might start to drive more slowly to give yourself a little bit more time to react to things that are going on around you. And at some point, if your processing speed is at a certain low level, you'll want to stop driving entirely. But again, these are very individual differences, so take that as you will. There's just a graph to kind of illustrate that change in reaction time over time. So this is the average reaction time in seconds. Now notice this is not a huge difference, okay? So we're not talking like you say hello and then 20 seconds later they say hello back. This is just, maybe about half a second longer. All right, a huge part of processing information depends upon whether and how you are paying attention. There are different types of attention. So you've got selective attention. Selective attention is focusing on a specific aspect of an experience that is relevant while ignoring others. This is a very executive function type of thing, which we'll talk a little bit more down here. But focusing on a specific aspect of an experience that's relevant and ignoring others. So trying to pay attention to what the teacher is saying and ignoring the fart sounds that the kid next to you is making. All right. Then you've got divided attention. This is concentrating on more than one activity at a time. So this might be trying to read something while someone else is talking to you and trying to listen to what they're saying at the same time. It's not great for attention. Divided attention, you can never give full attention to two different things at a time. So just be aware of that. That's, again, concentrating on more than one activity at a time. Sustained attention is when you are trying to maintain focus on something over a prolonged period. And this is often called vigilance. So if you know that something important is going on or is about to happen, you'll probably switch into sustained attention mode. So if my kids are just sitting in front of the TV, I don't need to worry too much. But if they're playing with the grill and trying to, they're at the age where, they're old enough. They're like 11 and 13, so they're not like tiny kids. So again, some things I don't need to worry about. But if they're outside learning how to build a fire for scouts, I'm going to be focusing on that. Okay, I'm going to be out there. I'm going to be watching. I'm going to be paying attention. I'm not going to wander away and let my attention drift. I'm going to pay attention to that. Or if you know if some very important information is coming, like if the teacher says, this will be on the test, your brain perks up a little bit. And then executive attention. This is focusing on action planning, goals, errors in compensation, monitoring, and the unknown. So executive attention is just those different things where you're trying to anticipate what might happen, paying attention to potential outcomes, things like that. So it's really higher order attention rather than just paying attention to what's in front of you. It's also paying attention to things that could be. Now, obviously, our attention does change over the course of our lives. In infancy, sustained attention or focus is linked to habituation and dishabituation. So habituation is what the term we use, the definition is decreased responsiveness to stimulus after repeated presentations. Don't you love some of these definitions? Okay, so in real terms, habituation is where you lose attention, you stop paying attention to something that just remains there. If you live someplace where there's a lot of traffic, like if you just move someplace and you're near an intersection where there's lots of cars and honking and things like that, initially that might grab your attention. But over time of it just you're constantly hearing cars, constantly hearing honking and things like that. Over time, you just don't notice it anymore. And so we get that in infancy. So if you have a mistake that some people might make when they have infants, especially a new baby, my brother just had a baby, but they'll try to be very quiet all the time. Whenever they put the baby down, they try to make absolutely no noise. And then they're surprised when when any sound wakes up the baby. Go about your business. Over time, the baby will stop responding as much to these stimulations, and they'll be able to sleep through that sort of thing. So we get used to it. We get used to things. That's habituation. Dishabituation is the reverse of that. So this is recovery of a habituated response after a change in stimulation. For a period of time, I had a lot of reminders on my phone where I would have the same tone play for every single notification, and eventually I would get to the point where it would beep, and I wouldn't even really pay attention to the fact it was beeping. I would just turn it off without really thinking about it, and I wouldn't even sometimes mentally process that I had done that. So I started changing the ringtone for different types of things so that it helps me pay attention a little bit better. So again, in infancy, that recovery of a habituated response. So something has been the same, but then all of a sudden something changes. Now there's something new, something different is occurring, and it catches their attention. That is dishabituation. Joint attention begins somewhere around 7 to 8 months of age. So this is when the baby and the parent or other person are paying attention to the same thing at the same time. So you're both looking at the dog, or you're both looking at the bird, or something like that. And then gaze following begins at 10 to 11 months of age. So this is where you might be looking at something and the child looks at you, notices that you're looking at something, and they point their eyes in the same direction that you are because they want to see, oh, they're looking at something. What are they looking at? And they point their eyes in that direction. Okay, so with joint attention, you might have to point and say, look. Okay, but 10 to 11 months of age, they can do that on their own. Now with joint attention, individuals, like I said, are focusing on the same object or event, and it requires a couple of things. One is the ability to track the other person's behavior. Okay, so just being able to notice what they're doing and follow along with that. You also have one person directing another person's attention. So in joint attention, let's say you have the mom or dad saying, look, or come over here, or check this out. And there's often a reciprocal interaction. So the thing that you might be getting them to focus on is you. So like, oh look, here's this puppet, isn't that cute? And they laugh and you laugh, and so there's this interaction between the two of you. The frequency of these caregiver-infant interactions greatly affect language development and vocabulary size. I tell people, when you have a baby, the first time you ever have a baby, it's terrifying because you realize, oh snap, I have no idea what I'm doing. It doesn't matter if you're an expert in child development. If it's your first child, you're terrified. But just keep in mind, it's like, just keep them fed, keep them clean, and talk to them. Okay, just snuggle them and interact with them. They don't know what you're saying. It's okay that they don't know what you're saying. Talk to them about whatever is going on in your life. It helps them to engage in that joint attention. So you're paying attention to them and talking to them. They're paying attention to you talking to them, and they start to get a sense of how language forms. We'll talk more about that in the language chapter, but it's huge. Please talk to your infants. Attention and our ability to control attention increases with age. Preschool children, they can they can pay attention to something that is attention grabbing. That's what when we say salient stimuli. If it grabs their attention, they'll be paying attention to it. But they don't have the best attention control. If you teach pre-K or preschool, you will know that you need to change up the activities every few minutes, no more than 10 minutes at a time, because otherwise they just start going, woohoo, off the walls. So they, sustained attention is still kind of difficult to them, but they can pay attention if something is attention grabbing, so salient. They also, I should say planfulness, but so planning improves. So they play and they're able to more clearly plan things and look at things a little bit more systematically and be like, okay, I'm going to play the mommy, and you're going to play the daddy, and you're going to play the dog, and this is what we're going to do. They're able to do that a little bit more. So with young children, most advances in executive and sustained attention are affected by early experiences in education. So it really depends a lot on, what they can do depends a lot on what they're being asked to do. So it's practice. When I watch the little kids at my church, this is they're like 2 and 3 years old, between 1.5 years and 3 years old, and I will blow bubbles. Not right now, we're not meeting, but I blow huge bubbles, and they all want to pop them. And so I make this game where they have to take turns. Okay, it's so-and-so's turn. Okay, it's so-and-so's turn. And so it helps them to pay. I'll do it in a very clear order, like from left to right or right to left or something like that. And eventually they start to get this idea of, okay, so I know that it's not my turn, but I know that after this person, it's my turn. And they start to get the hang of it. And whenever there's a new kid that comes in, at first they want to leap in front of someone else's bubble to pop it. And so we have to work on that. But again, just with practice, early experiences in education, children learn to be able to do these things. And believe me, they pay attention to whether or not it's their turn to pop the bubble. Okay, in adolescence, this is where you start to get even better at paying attention. You get better at processing, or at least not paying attention to irrelevant information. This gets better and better again through childhood and then into adolescence. We get better at just ignoring things that are not important. The ability to shift from one activity to the other at will becomes more easy. So if you have a younger child on the playground, they're playing and whatnot, and you tell them, okay, it's time to stop paying attention to that and start paying attention to this, it's harder for a younger child. By adolescence, that becomes easier. So they become better at tasks that require this skill. They also become better at multitasking. So the number of competing tasks that they can do increases with age. The expanding information that's attended to, that they become better at that. But it can be distracting. The fact that they become better at multitasking makes them try to multitask more, and a lot of times this will be them trying to multitask at things that should not be multitasked. So, texting and driving, things like that. Don't do that. And of course, just with any individual differences, processing ability varies among adolescents. So it's not like just because we're better than we were when we were children doesn't mean that we're great at multitasking. I know I'm not. And then adulthood. Older adults may not be able to focus on relevant information as effectively as younger adults. So again, we have these changes over time where we become less adept at selective attention. So focusing on one thing and ignoring other things. Older adults, and by older adults we mean 50 to 80, they performed worse in divided attention conditions than two younger groups. Part of this is affected by vision changes and also environmental distractions. So again, that not inability, but lessened ability to ignore certain things and focus on others, that gets a little bit more difficult. So you will find yourself, for example, turning down the radio when you're trying to spot which street to turn on, and it's not because sound interferes with vision. It's the attention that is problematic here. So if you have lyrics playing, music blasting or something like that, that's competing for your attention, and you need more attention capabilities to try to find which street you're supposed to turn on. So you might turn off the music so you can focus your attention more on the visual stimuli. All right, a little bit more going into memory. So we talked about attention. Let's talk about memory. Memory is the retention of information over time. So maybe you heard something, but whether or not you remember it depends upon whether or not you held on to that information over time. The processes of memory, which we mentioned briefly before, has to do with how information is encoded, retained, and then later stored. And memory has a lot of imperfections. We do not take snapshots with our mind. It's not like a computer where you save it and you pull it back up and it's identical before. There's a lot of things that can go wrong to it, or wrong with it, and I'll mention those in a little bit. So these three processes of memory. So first you've got encoding. So this is getting information into your memory, the things you see, the things you hear, taste, smell, all that stuff. Then you've got storage. So this is retaining information over time. This could be very brief, like in short-term memory, or it could be more long-term storage. And then something that we're very interested in is retrieval. So this is getting information out of storage. If you have ever been in a situation where you had a tip of the tongue experience, where you knew the word that you were trying to say, but it's just not coming to you, that will help you to distinguish between storage and retrieval. It's stored in there. You know the word for that, and you know that you know the word for that thing, but it's just not coming to you. You're not pulling it out of storage yet, and then something might happen and you suddenly remember it. Okay, maybe you hear something that sounds similar, or you walk back into the room where you went and something just cues you. One of the reasons why memory is both great and not so great is because we construct memories. Again, they're not like photographs or files on a computer. We reconstruct memories. We have bits and pieces that we actually remember, and then we use schemas to fill in the gaps in our memories with assumptions based on what we know about these things. So it's one of the reasons why memories are inaccurate. So people construct and reconstruct memories, and we often mold our memories to fit information that already exists in our mind. So we can actually have pretty incomplete memories of a lot of things. So schemas are mental frameworks that organize concepts and information, and they affect our ability to encode information and retrieve it. So it can make it easier for us to encode information and retrieve information because if we already understand the process of, say, going to a restaurant. You go in and someone seats you and they bring you a menu and you order off the menu, and someone brings you food and then you pay for the food and then you leave. So you have this idea, you have this schema in your head of, what going to a restaurant entails. And so when you have that, it makes it easier for you to remember the actual events of going to a restaurant. But it can also help you to misremember events because you might assume that something happened because that's what always happens at restaurants, but it didn't, but maybe you didn't catch that. It can be kind of quirky. In infancy, we have something called childhood amnesia or infantile amnesia. Generally, we don't recall much, if anything, from the first 3 years. So one major reason of this is an immature prefrontal lobe. Our prefrontal lobe is very much involved in taking this information and processing it in a way that would transfer it to long-term memory. And before that process of that maturing frontal lobe is complete, children just kind of live in the now. And for the most part, they're not developing these conscious long-term memories. So it really plays an important role in the memory of events. Now, memory in childhood gets a little bit better. So this time memory starts to improve considerably, but it's not necessarily all that great. Okay, so a 4-year-old can remember things, but if you were asking them to testify in court about something, you have to be really, really careful with that because children who are younger and children and individuals who are more susceptible to suggestion and whatnot, it can really affect their ability to accurately remember events. It's very easy to lead them on, and so you have to be careful with that. There is implicit memory and explicit memory. Implicit memory is memory without conscious recollection, or memory of skills and routine procedures that are performed automatically. So, we learned how to walk, and even if we don't have a conscious recollection of learning how to walk, we know how to do it. If you've ever learned how to ride a bike and then gone many, many years without riding a bike, you get on it and, after a couple of wobbles, you're still able to do it. Now, explicit memory is conscious memory of facts and experiences. So again, that's the difference between knowing how to ride a bike and remembering when you learned how to ride a bike. Those are two different things. So a conscious memory of facts and experiences. I remember that this happened, or I remember that this is a fact or a figure that I can recite. That's explicit memory. In adulthood, working memory and processing speed peak at around age 45, and then they start to decline after around 57. Now, it's not like you hit exactly these ages and all of a sudden things crash, but it's just general trends. So these are linked to aging. They're also linked to reading and math achievement. So as this processing speed slows down, it takes longer to read things. It takes longer to solve mathematical equations and things like that. And it's not because you're not getting dumber. That's not what this is. It's just the processing speed slows down. It just takes you more time. That's all this is. And this decline affects both new and old information. So it just takes you longer to pull up information, to recollect information that you already knew. Things just take longer, and that's all that is, and it's nothing to worry about. So I mentioned that human memory has a lot of flaws. One is transience, and that's just the fact that over time you forget. Okay, just things fade with time. So that's what transience is. Absent-mindedness. Most of the time, if someone can't remember something, it's because they weren't paying attention to begin with. Blocking is when you're trying to remember something, but something else is coming to your mind instead. So if you're trying to remember someone's name, but someone else's name keeps coming into your head. Like I was trying to remember someone's name. Someone was named Miranda, but I kept thinking Melinda because I have a friend named Melinda, and I kept thinking Melinda whenever I was trying to remember Miranda's name. It drove me crazy. Eventually, remember I talked about, excuse me, I talked about imagery and helping in memory. Well, one way that I helped to overcome this blocking is that when, for the 15th time, when I finally, what is your name? Miranda. I was like, okay, I need something to help me remember that her name is Miranda and not Melinda. And so, by the way, this kid was like 7. So I just imagine her getting arrested, okay, like, it's like with the handcuffs and everything, and the cop reading her Miranda rights. All right, so with that imagery in my head, which you're not going to forget because it's crazy imagery. So just this sweet little girl just getting completely arrested and having her Miranda rights read to her. And so the next time I saw her, I had that imagery in my head, and I'm like, Miranda. Okay, so these are things that you can do. Misattribution is when we have a memory of something, but we misattribute where we heard it or where it was, that sort of thing. So you might think, oh, I read this in the news, but actually you heard it from your cousin. Suggestibility is a human memory flaw where it's easy for us to manipulate the way that people remember those events, the way that they fill in events. So if there was an experiment done where they showed people images, videos of 2 cars colliding with each other, and then a week later they asked them some questions about this video, and one of the questions was, how fast would you estimate the cars were going when they contacted each other? But some others were told, how fast do you think they were going when they hit each other, when they collided with each other, when they smashed into each other? And the people that were asked how fast do you estimate they were going when they smashed into each other, they recalled the cars going at a higher speed than they actually were compared to the people who were just given a neutral question of when they contacted each other. They were also asked, was there any broken glass? So about a third of the people who were asked how fast would you think they were going when they contacted each other, about a third said, yeah, I saw broken glass. By the way, there was no broken glass in the video. Whereas the ones where you said how fast were they going when they smashed into each other, the majority of those people said, yes, there was broken glass. So the wording can really make or break a memory. So we're highly suggestible. There's also bias. We remember the things that we want to remember, and we forget the things that we don't want to think about or agree with. And then there's persistence. Sometimes we want to forget, but we can't. So persistence would be a memory that keeps coming to mind. Maybe it was an embarrassing moment or a traumatic moment, and that just keeps coming back into your mind. So that's another flaw. Usually we think of memory flaws as being I can't remember. Persistence is a situation where you're trying to forget and you can't. And then finally, very briefly, I just wanted to touch on something with regard to metacognition. So again, metacognition is just thinking about the way that you think, or knowing about knowing. And the thing that I want you to know about here is something called theory of mind. Theory of mind develops somewhere between around 3 and 5 years old for most people. And this is an awareness of one's own mental processes and the mental processes of others. If you remember from an earlier lecture where I said that some kids are terrible at hide and seek, they'll put a blanket over their head or put their face in the corner or something. When we're little, we're kind of touch and go when it comes to different minds and our own. But between 3 and 5, we develop an awareness of our own mental processes and also the mental processes of others. So one of the first things that we develop in here is that other people have other perceptions than us. So just because we can see something doesn't necessarily mean that they can see something. And then there's emotions. Just because we feel something doesn't mean that they feel something, or they might feel an emotion. So a child who has developed theory of mind, they might see a child looking sad and recognize that they're sad and go over and be like, hey, are you okay? Okay. And then there's awareness of people having different desires than you. So a child who hasn't quite gotten the hang of theory of mind will give you a present that they would like. Okay, so they'll give you a present that they would like, and they assume that you would like it because it's something like they'll give you their favorite toy or something like that, which is a high honor. But just that theory of mind is just when they develop it, that's the idea that understanding that people can perceive things differently than you, can feel things differently than you, and can desire things differently than you. I will be posting a video on this so you can see some examples of that. But this is also when they start to realize that people can have false beliefs. So there's a little thing where you show a kid a box of Smarties, and you say, what do you think is in this box? And they say, Smarties. And you open it up, and surprise, it's pencils. And they close, and then the adult closes it up, and they say, I'm going to show these to, whatever, Susie. What do you think Susie is going to think is in the box? Now, before developing theory of mind, the little kid is going to say pencils. They're going to think that Susie is going to think that there's pencils in the box because they know that there's pencils in the box, and they don't realize that Susie has a different perception. But once a child develops theory of mind, if you ask them, what do you think Susie will think is the box? They're going to say Smarties. She's going to think that there's Smarties in the box. Tee-hee-hee. Okay, so then, playing pranks and stuff, that's when they start to be able to do that sort of thing. Okay, so that is what I wanted to talk about here. And so take a look at the chapter notes, take a look at the videos that I post, and I will be posting the discussion question very shortly. All right, thanks.